Hello, welcome and welcome back to my channel. My name is Veronia, and in today's video I really want to talk about emergency funds. Now, I've specifically decided to focus on this today because I feel like having an emergency fund is probably going to be even more critical now more than ever. So in this video I really want to explain exactly what an emergency fund is if you don't already know. Then I want to talk about how much you should have in your emergency fund and also how you can start saving up for your emergency fund if you haven't already. So without further ado, let's just get started. So first of all, let's just clarify and understand exactly what we mean when we're talking about emergency funds. So if you're new to my channel, you may not know that sometimes I like to get the Google definition first and then I like to explain it in my own words. So when it comes to Wikipedia, because that's what I like to use sometimes, what it says is that an emergency fund, also known as a contingency fund, is a personal budget set aside as a financial safety net for future mishaps or unexpected expenses. Now, when it comes to my own words, honestly, an emergency fund is pretty much what it says in the name. So you basically will just have a pot of money that is dedicated for emergencies. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I seem to see is when people have a dedicated emergency fund, they haven't necessarily clarified what they mean by an emergency. So for example, in my case, when I'm thinking about emergencies, an emergency would probably be me losing my job and having to pay for my expenses. Or another emergency could be that your car ends up breaking down for no apparent reason. However, there is a difference between having an emergency fund and having something that should probably be a sinking fund. And so what I mean is that with sinking funds, that's basically where you might have a pot set aside for general expenses that you know will come up in the future. So if we look back at the car example, if my car suddenly broke down for no reason, then yes, I would probably classify that as an emergency. However, paying for normal road coverage or having to pay for my car insurance would not be classified as an emergency. The reason being is because I'm expecting to pay that every single year. And so if there are things that I know are genuinely going to come up, I would essentially create a sinking fund for it. And if you want to learn more about what sinking funds are in the first place, I do have a video talking about that in much more detail. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. I will link it up here for you and in the description below. So it's actually really important to understand exactly what you mean by an emergency fund, because that's going to provide you a lot more clarification when it comes to knowing exactly what is a general emergency versus what could be a sinking fund, which you should potentially be saving up for separately. And if you're liking this video so far, then feel free to give me a thumbs up, as it really does help to support the channel, plus it's free. Okay, so now we know what an emergency fund is. One of the biggest questions, and especially my clients tend to ask me all the time, is how much should I have in my emergency fund? Now, usually what most experts will say is ideally you want to have between 3 and 6 months worth of expenses, and some experts may even go up to a year's worth of expenses. However, I actually have slightly different thoughts around this. So when it comes to figuring out how much you should have in your emergency fund, I actually think it's going to depend on your own personal circumstances. So for example, in my case, when I'm talking to my clients, I don't just say pick 3 or 6 months or even a year's worth of expenses. What I say is really think about your own circumstances. So for example, are you in a stable industry where you're less likely to be laid off? When it comes to your household in terms of who pays the bills, is it down to 1 income or 2 incomes? Do you maybe have a side hustle so that if you do lose your job, you at least have some money to tide you over? What is your risk tolerance like? So for example, would you rather have a bit more cash compared to hardly any cash at all? All of these things I think are really important to take into consideration, because even though I may be more comfortable having a 3-month emergency fund, you may be a lot more comfortable with having a 6 or even 9-month emergency fund. So really make sure you're trying to take those things into consideration when you're thinking about how much you should personally have in your emergency fund. Now, if you do want to learn more about emergency funds, sinking funds, or when you should actually be saving up for everything, definitely make sure you check out my free money management guide, because I just talk about the key steps that I took to not only manage and save my money, but to also start growing my money through investing as well. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. I'll leave a link up here for you and in the description below. Okay, so now we know exactly what an emergency fund is and how much you should have in your emergency fund. I do want to talk about the reasons why having an emergency fund is probably more critical now more than ever. So one of the biggest reasons why I'm a huge advocate for having an emergency fund is really because it will allow you to weather the storm, especially if we do end up being in a recession. So in case you've been living under a rock lately, you may not know that prices have been rising dramatically, and so we've had all of this high inflation, and at the same time there are talks of having a potential recession. And if we are in a recession, well, there are some some consequences with that. So for example, people are less likely to spend money, and if people aren't spending money, then that means that businesses aren't making money, and if businesses aren't making money, then they're not going to have enough money to pay their employees, and so they may have to lay off part of their workforce. And so let's say that unfortunately you end up losing your job. One of the biggest questions you probably will have is, how are you going to pay for your bills? How are you going to pay for your expenses? And so that's why an emergency fund is going to be so important, especially during this time, because if anything happens to your income stream, you at least have some money to pay for your expenses over the next few months, so that you can focus on either maybe finding another job or even starting a side hustle. And if you want to learn more about the potential upcoming recession, I already have a couple of videos on that, so make sure you check that out if you haven't already. I will link one up here for you and in the description below. Now, when it comes to having an emergency fund, most likely it's going to be easily accessible, so you're probably going to have it in some type of savings account. Now, at the same time, you may also be thinking, hold up, Veronia, okay, I know I should have an emergency fund, but if I keep it in a savings account getting like 1% interest, if inflation is about 8%, does that really make sense? And yes, I definitely see where you're coming from, but I still think it's really important to consider having your emergency in some type of savings account or something that's going to be easily accessible, and here's why. So for me, when it comes to having an emergency fund, I'm not looking to grow that at all. In fact, I kind of see my emergency fund as an insurance, and so I want it to be easily accessible just in case I need it. So for example, if my boss tells me that I'm being laid off today, I would want to make sure that I can actually get that money quickly, especially if I know that I'm going to need to pay my bills maybe within the next few weeks or next couple of months. Plus, if you're thinking about investing your money for your future, the worst thing you want to be doing is having to sell your investments at a loss because you need the money now. And so when it comes to having an emergency fund and making sure that it's separate, what that will do is just bridge the gap so that you can basically still pay for your essential bills without having to touch your investments. And this is going to be especially important if you realize that the markets have gone down. And so whilst it can be annoying to know that inflation is so high, but at the same time your savings accounts isn't really doing much, I still think that there is an element of safety of just making sure that you have some cash on hand just in case you end up having an emergency. So when it comes to your emergency fund, the next thing you want to be thinking about is how you're actually going to save up or build that emergency fund. So the first thing is, again, as I've mentioned, you want to understand realistically how much you will want to save. So is it going to be 3 months worth of your core expenses? Is it going to be 6 months, or is it even going to be a year? So for example, let's say that my essential expenses come to about $2,000 a month and I ideally want a 3-month emergency fund. Well, then that means I'm going to need to save $6,000 for my emergency fund. The next thing I would be doing is figuring out when exactly do you want to have that emergency fund built. So for example, is it within the next 3 months? It could be 6 months, or it could even be 12 months. Really figuring out when you want to build that emergency fund is going to help you, because then you can understand how much you'll need to save each month in order for you to reach that goal. So let's say with the previous example, I know that I need to save about $6,000 in total. Well, if my goal is to have that emergency fund built within the next 6 months, that means that I'll need to be setting aside $1,000 each month in order for me to reach the $6,000 goal by the end of 6 months. And so once you have that goal, that's when you also want to have a look at your budget, because you want to identify exactly what is coming in versus what's going out, so you can understand how much potential spare cash you have. And it's going to help you understand whether realistically you can reach that goal or if you may need to tweak it slightly. So for example, if you realize in your budget that actually you can only save about $800 a month, then it obviously means that either you're going to have to make more money to try and bridge that gap, or you may try to find ways to reduce your expenses. Alternatively, what you could do is actually change the timeline. So rather than it taking 6 months, you may have to just move the goal to about 8 months instead. Now, if you feel like you're in a position where you do really want to start taking control of your finances so that you can save money for your emergency fund and eventually invest in your future, then make sure you do check out my one-on-one coaching, because I've been able to help my clients not only save money for things like their emergency fund, but they've also been able to save more money so that they can invest it for their future and hopefully become financially independent too. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. You can book a free sales call with me. So I'll link more information up here for you and in the description below. So if you did like this video, then please do give me a thumbs up if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments, do you think having an emergency fund is important? I do post every Tuesday, so if you would like to know more, then of course you can subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys next Tuesday.